So this is what a very fast subwoofer is capable of. So that's what the speaker's on. So the purpose of a subwoofer is to blend in with the speakers and augment the low end, and it should blend in as seamlessly as possible. That means that it should actually match the response curve, but it should also match the detail of the speakers. Like obviously you wouldn't want to get a crappy subwoofer that sounds all muddled. And that's kind of how you judge a subwoofer, is whether it chuffs, it makes distortion, or whatever. But in general, the speed of a subwoofer is pretty much how fast it's able to actually make changes. Because even if you have a high pass filter on, or I mean in this case a low pass filter, you may be blocking out frequencies at, let's say, 80 hertz, but there's still a lot of textural data that could happen when you mix a lot of sounds that aren't just a sine wave. Like a lightning, like thunder, for instance, is a full texture that isn't just, a mumble. It's actually like as fully spacious as the actual high end. So a slower subwoofer will add the low end velvet kind of mumble that'll fill in the low end, but it won't add the spaciousness of the low end. And that's why people spend more money on things like, like a better subwoofer. But this is a subwoofer that is an interesting case because it's been through about 10 years and it still hasn't actually been altered from its original design, except for it has only become more cheaply designed, but it is still touted as a great subwoofer. It's now called the T2 slimline sub, but it uses the same exact driver, same exact amp. It just doesn't have like the fancy design and the passive radiator anymore. Watch. This is how tonal the bass is. You're gonna probably need headphones. The song just end? Here, let me switch it to a song that has a little bit more bass going with it. Where is it? Jesus Christ, come on, where are you? There you are. Okay. So I'm running these in stereo. So they're actually, this is in line with that. That's in line with that. So I'm actually getting stereo bass, which matters a lot more, especially when you have a faster bass section, because then you could actually hear the differences in the textures. But all that texture right there is happening because the speaker is capable of doing it. It's fast enough that's actually able to take everything that's being fed into it below 80 hertz and it just plays it as well as it would if it was a mid woofer. So a slower subwoofer, for tones like that, you would hear a lot more just like a velvety undertone. With a faster subwoofer, you actually hear like the texture. And the texture should actually be equal to the texture that you would get from the LS50s or whatever, any of the rest of the sound system. There shouldn't be any lower amount of resolution that the subwoofer is capable of than any of the other speakers, because the content is full range. So here's how it sounds with the speakers on. So what it does is that the HTB was actually the original platform that they used to reboot KEF's low frequency drivers. The reason why the T2 is still modern and capable of still using the same amp and driver is because the driver design for this is still the basis for all of KEF's low frequency drivers. It's actually a pretty clever design in retrospect. It's actually one of those things where it's obvious in retrospect. Like, you would want a driver that's able to mute its own back wave to get rid of the distortion that could possibly occur internally, while the front diaphragm is able to be as nimble as possible. So you want it to be lightweight and be able to sing as fast and agile as possible. So what they did was they took a normal cone driver and put holes in it. They actually vented it. So they tuned the driver so that there'd be basically two sandwiched drivers together. You have a flat long throw driver sandwiched together with a cone that has holes in it. So it's a rear vented cone essentially. So the driver is able to not only prevent the back wave from reaching the front diaphragm, so then you don't get any actual ring distortion, but you have the rigidity of the cone, so you get obviously the stiffness that you want, which is why drivers are typically done in a cone shape. But also, any ringing that would happen is contained within the front diaphragm and the rear cone. So even the front diaphragm is automatically damping, I guess is a better term. So whatever the front diaphragm is doing, it's able to constantly release its energy, because it doesn't have to deal with anything that's happening inside the box. It only has to deal with the air between the front diaphragm and the driver right behind it. So if you imagine if they were to make it so that this was a long throw driver and it was a flat diaphragm, as the thing pistoned in and out, you clearly hear a lot of back wave action, since whenever the driver strokes backward, it'd be pushing air directly back and reflecting air directly back forward, and so the driver diaphragm alone would constantly be contending with itself. So it would have to constantly fight what it previously did through ringing, while it's still catching up and playing what it's constantly currently playing at the moment. This doesn't happen with these because of the way that they're designed. the long throw driver is able to play as if there is absolutely no back wave at all. It plays as if it's just a free 1-to-1 relationship between input and output as far as reproducing the signal that's given. The cone, on the other hand, is what takes the brunt of what all the rear ringing would otherwise incur. The rear cone then takes that rear ringing and dampens it because it's actually separated from the front diaphragm by its own separate surround. So there's no way for the rear cone to transfer any of its ringing to the front diaphragm, which effectively makes it so that any internal cabinet ringing is completely muted. So it's a really clever design, and I'm surprised that other companies haven't done that before. And it's not a surprise that that's the way KEF's been doing it ever since. That's even how the blade is designed. And the new R series, new reference series, is all based off of the same hybrid woofers. The design of the HTB2, which are these, is the same as HTB1s. This is just a bit more powerful. They were designed so that they could actually be a foundational prototype for what would then become the new Q series, which is based off of a sealed design with active woofers matched with passive woofers. It's kind of interesting, but the new Q series is actually kind of a backward step. And a lot of it has to do with inflation. I don't want to get too much into that, but the Q900 is not really equivalent to the prior Q series. The prior Q series, the IQ90s, for instance, had 2 active drivers, and the Uni-Q, which is 2. So you had the tweeter, the mid, and then 2 active drivers. So that would makes it a 3-way. The IQ7SEs were actually a 1.5 way. That meant that it had a full range driver, a woofer at the bottom, and it had the Uni-Q. And so the woofer on the bottom was just a single woofer and a port. And being 1.5 way, that means that it would just match whatever the mid woofer on top was doing. And being as the lower frequency driver was more capable of deeper bass, it just gave you the deeper bass. And with the design of the box, the lute shaped cabinet and the port, it gave you the deeper bass along with the mid. And then the tweeter gave you the sparkly highs. So you got the mids, the smoothness and everything, the body of the sound from the outer woofer of the Uni-Q. You got the details and the spatial cues and everything from the tweeter, and full range matching the woofer. You had the mid woofer, you had the low frequency driver blasting according to the mid woofer, but leveraging the internal volume of the box to increase its output. And due to the design of it being a more massive driver, it was able to draw down deeper and extend much deeper than the mid was capable of. So that plus the box plus the port allowed the IQ SEs to be a 1.5 way design that was able to play very, very deep and pretty effective. And it was actually considered like a very good upgrade from the IQ7 originals, which were a 3-way design. So odd enough, they simplified it, improved the design of the cabinet, and they actually ended up with a better speaker. They then took the IQ7s, and rather than having a port, they added 2 passive radiators. So that new IQ 900s, which are actually larger. So, for instance, like the tweeter went from being a 1/4 of an inch to a full inch. The woofer itself is bigger. The box is much bigger, but the core design is the same. There's still a 1.5 design. The lower active woofer is still just a single woofer. On the outside it looks like 3, but it's actually 1. And the 2 passive woofers are actually scaled 1-to-1, so it looks like convincing like you do have 3 active drivers when it's actually only 1 active driver powering 2. So every time that the center active driver pushes forward, the passive drivers pull back. Every time and vice versa. So they kind of just switch back and forth, and then that's pretty much using the same type of logic as a reflex design, where the internal Helmholtz resonance of the box, which is tuned to whatever frequency that is optimal, that is as low as the IQ7 SEs were meant to play down to, which I think was something like 40. They did the same thing with the Q900s, except for rather than using a port and a loop-shaped cabinet, which was actually a lot more expensive, because the purpose of the loop-shaped cabinet and the forward-facing port worked together so that it would actually prevent any standing waves, mute any sort of like internal chuffing, any sort of negative sound you would get from hearing directly through the port. The new design is just a big square box, which is cheaper to make, but due to it being completely sealed and switching to active radiators, they were able to make it so that you got the same extension as the IQ7 SEs, but you no longer heard the inside of the box. So the inside of the box could be as noisy as it wants. And you could look at the design of the IQ7 SEs versus the Q900s, and they might as well have been made from completely different speaker manufacturers. But the Q900s get away with actually having a build quality that is objectively not as good as the IQ7s. You can even count the parts, and you can see that it's clearly not as good. And it gets away with it by being completely sealed. So the only thing that you hear is the leveraging of the Helmholtz frequency of the internal volume of the box being leveraged so that the back wave of the single active driver is powering the twin passive drivers. So when it reaches that lower Helmholtz frequency, it actually sounds like it's able to play much deeper, because effectively it is actually behaving as if there are 3 drivers happening at once, because of the back wave inside of the cavity is rigging the same way like an opera singer would sing, build up the frequency of the resonance of a glass and explode it. As the tone goes deeper in a sealed box, that tone builds up. As that tone builds up, it causes the active driver builds up that tone and causes the building up of that energy to activate the passive drivers, and the passive drivers can't do anything but to explode the same way that the opera singer would explode the glass. But instead of exploding, it's releasing energy. So the 2 passive radiators then, I guess, controllably explode sound into the room. And it's an effective design, and it works very well, but it's based off of the experimentation that happened here, which is where they use 1 active driver and 1 passive driver, and they did it effective enough where the way that the rear cone is profiled, it actually blasts air outward around in a toroidal shape that kind of automatically gets out of its own way. So as the back wave is trying to push the cone shoots backward another time. Due to the shape of the cone being conical, it's actually able to just, it's aerodynamic essentially enough that the back wave doesn't affect it, and the cone then just shoots air again outward in a loop, and that's what powers the rear passive radiator. And it works well enough actually that you could blast this thing, and I actually have it on stands, and it's still able to actually play without wobbling, which is pretty impressive for something that you imagine is not truly. Here, let me play some more bass. So yeah, that's pretty bassy, and you can see how it's not really shaking anything. And this is actually not the way that I can move this thing. This thing is actually meant to resist force this way, not that way. But the way that the air moves inside the cabinet is so well controlled that it behaves as if it's actually a force canceling sub, which is pretty cool. So you hear those lows? And you see how like the subwoofer doesn't even move? So they went through like 4 or 5 generations with these guys, and then the current iteration of the HTB is the T2, which is called their slimline sub, and it's made out of just a square box. It's the same amp and the same woofer, but they no longer needed it to be a prototype for use practicing scaling their AVRs anymore, mass loading the AVRs anymore, because AVRs are actually pretty complicated. So they went ahead and just did what they could have always done and just made a bigger box that was square, and it was just a wooden MDF box. No gaskets, no rods, no seals, no metal, no anything. But it still has the benefit of having the dual diaphragm cone. So even though it's in a very slim, the T2 is in a slim box that's actually it's actually larger than this, surprisingly. It's a larger volume box. The driver's still able to blast full range without the rear wave of the box causing the front diaphragm to ring. So the T2 still sounds very clear, and it still sounds very good, but it's still inferior to the design of the HTB2. The HTB2 is actually like a more modern, more innovative design versus the T2, which is pretty much a much more basic, just the most minimal configuration you could possibly have of the same exact thing as this. But yeah, that growl, that texture are all things that are only capable because the subwoofer is actually fast enough to do it. It's actually fast enough to hear. You can hear the mids all the way up to like 300 hertz. But yeah, I mean, the easiest way to figure out how fast a subwoofer is pretty much just how clearly it plays highs. That's pretty common sense if you think about it. Because if it could play clearly high, then you know that it could be fast enough to play clearly low. So I find these to be very, very good matches to anything. Especially to KEFs. Because they were designed to match with KEF. So even the natural crossover, if you were to play them full range, it actually just fits perfectly with the LS50s and with the 3001s because they're both designed with the same voicing in mind. So I'll put these back on. So these are some of my favorite speakers. The voicing is pretty much identical to these, but smoother and more three-dimensional. Whereas these are, they're closer together, so they're gonna sound like a little bit more like in your face. And they're actually a bit louder too, but they're both 100 watts. But the smoothness of these guys is just something else. Check this out. So now I'm playing these guys. So if anybody ever thought that throughout the I didn't bother volume mashing this time, but the LS50s do sound more intimate and they're a bit brighter, which I hear is a complaint among a lot of people. So I actually tend to listen to these more often just because they're way more comfortable. And they both blend with the HTB2s perfectly. So yeah, it's just, those two are probably among the most underrated KEF classics ever. Because they were the first to actually use all the new things that KEF used to this very day. They're the first to use the new KEF Uni-Q on those guys. And the first to use the new hybrid woofer and the ABRs. And you can kind of tell by how over-engineered they are that they were intended to be a lot more than just another release, especially how they just kind of completely nuked the whole entire platform. Even though they were immensely popular, they just completely eliminated them. And they just went back to making eggs for some reason. And the obvious reason is that you can't have the cannibalism of having the eggs actually sound anywhere as good as these guys. So here's how the bass sounds again. Hear the tightness, like the stop. Especially in 3D, it just gives you a lot more of like a holographicness that I guess I could see why a lot of people might not see they might not appreciate having their subwoofers in stereo formation, and I would account that to the subwoofers being too muffled. Because if your subwoofers play down to, let's say, 20 hertz, they're probably not going to play very clear up to anything higher than like 150 hertz, which means they're not capable of the full range of high resolution texture that you would get from a subwoofer that might not play necessarily as low, but it plays low enough for music, which doesn't really go deeper than 40 hertz typically. 30 hertz, which is what these go down to, is pretty much as deep as I've ever heard most music ever go down to. But yeah, it's a very easy trick if you're looking for like a slim, pretty cool looking subwoofer that behaves like a force canceled sub. Is extremely easy to place. You could put it on a pedestal and it doesn't rattle. You could put it on its side, has 3 feet, and it actually becomes like a upward or downward, I guess, firing subwoofer. You could choose which side, whether you want the lower frequency driver or the higher frequency driver to fire upward or downward, which causes more or less rumble versus more or less tone. So if you wanted to have more of the visual, the visceral experience, as if a subwoofer was actually playing down past 20 hertz, you would just put it so that the lower frequencies are firing into the floor, and you'd actually feel as if the subwoofer is actually playing lower. Since anything lower than 20 hertz, your ears don't really register a sound anyway. You kind of just feel it. So, if anyone's in the market for the T2s, I would definitely recommend these guys. I mean, their build quality is just much better in general, and the sound quality is better. It has more features, as far as like it's just designed better. It has the same driver. The driver was so over engineered that it's still the same type of driver they're still using right now, and it actually just seems to work with any speaker, and that's evident because back when they made the XQ10s, which was considered pretty much the end of the line for their original Uni-Q patent, they matched these with the XQ10s, and they were so proud of the XQ10s that they actually called that, finally 30 years later or whatever the heck, we finally brought back the LS35As, and that was the XQ10s. And then later on, they came out with the LS50s and said the same thing. And that had more to do with the fact that they had to change the complete design of the Uni-Q and needed an excuse to explain away why the sound was so different. And so the difference in sound was then just accounted to the attempt to revise or to reboot the LS35As. And it worked. I mean, these actually do sound very good. They sound very, very, very much like the LS35As. They have the same very smooth, very just great vocal presentation. They're just really great monitors. But they're not quite as smooth as these guys, which were the original model for these guys. You actually look back at the KEF Museum, you'll notice that these are actually the first to use the new Uni-Qs. And the way you can tell is that the new Uni-Qs actually use tweeters that actually fire completely clear, whereas, so you kind of see the same thing here, because you can see how like they made the surround receded to make sure that the tweeter could actually fire completely clear, and did the same thing here. I'll show you otherwise. So these are the IQ90s. The driver is based off of the XQ series, which was the last culmination, like the swan song of the original Uni-Q, and it's actually a great driver. It's what defined the original Uni-Q design. Notice how you can't see the tweeter at the furthest extension. The reason why, oh shoot, I'm back. Maybe I'll cut that out. Maybe I'll be too lazy. Hopefully it won't be too bad. But the reason why was actually not necessarily a bad thing. The way that these worked was that the original Uni-Q specified that the tweeter actually uses the outer rim as a waveguide. And what that does pretty well is it effectively makes the tweeter sound as big as the woofer, because the tweeter and the woofer are actually designed to be profiled to meet at 90-degree angles. So the woofer and the tweeter are designed so that as the tweeter disperses, it meets the outer rim, and then the sound generated from the woofer is interlaced with the tweeter. So the tweeter and the woofer actually sound like it's one gigantic source of sound. And this was made even better once they added the Tangerine waveguide, because that gave them more control over the ability to handle the dispersion, and it created the opportunity to hop to the next generation. But even in this form, it allowed them to fully perfect the dispersion of the tweeter and its interplay with the mid-woofer as its waveguide. So it still has a sound that is different and not necessarily worse than the new Uni-Q. It's actually just different. It's almost like comparing Fine or Tannoy to KEF. It's just a different design, and it has its own merits, and it sounds good in its own way. Because I noticed when I first heard the new Uni-Qs, I could hear the tweeter, and that was something I was kind of surprised about. Whereas with these, I can't really hear the tweeter. It actually sounds like the whole thing is the tweeter, and the whole thing is the midwoofer, even when I'm standing right in front of it, which I thought was pretty cool.